And we're on air. Hi, this is Luke Johnson from Noetic. Today we're doing something different. We're employing Google Hangouts to bring scholars from across the country and across the world together to discuss big ideas. And today I'm joined by Robert Schutt, and we're going to be discussing the first two upbuilding discourses from Soren Kierkegaard's 18 upbuilding discourses. So without further ado, let me introduce my guest, Robert Schutt.
Yeah, hi. Just a few words about me. I am a retired engineer, and I decided after that to go into teaching. And the teaching kind of brought me to Bible teaching. So that's pretty much what I do right now. I do Bible teaching at our church. I create my own Bible studies, usually from scratch. And that usually occupies most of my time. And then I do some videos on YouTube, and that's where Luke and I came together. So that's about it.
Yeah, I was going to say that this whole relationship was very emergent because I was scouring the internet for resources on Soren Kierkegaard, and I came across all of Robert's Kierkegaard videos, and I thought they were astonishingly good. And especially the ones on fear and trembling and purity of heart. I believe you also have ones up. Do you have one up on repetition? What do you have up on Soren already?
Oh, the present age, I think, is the other one that you left out. That was my first one. Yeah. So I think I only have about four up on Kierkegaard, but they're pretty long. They're pretty big, difficult projects. So. They come few and far between.
And your YouTube channel is just Robert Schutt. Is that how people can find you on YouTube?
Yeah, Robert Schutt, SCHUT.
Excellent.
And I should do it.
Well, yeah, and the reason why I wanted to have Robert on is because he is a very meticulous reader of Soren Kierkegaard, and we're operating in the same headspace, and I thought he'd be great for this project. So I guess without further ado, we should jump into the text because it's going to be a lot of material to cover today. And I'm going to be kind of learning it as we're talking about it. I hope people don't think that I have some sort of wizard-like mastery of it as we go. I usually start off with giving a little bit of background information, if you're okay with that. Maybe you have some background information that you want to add to it as well, Robert. What I want to say here is that what's interesting about these discourses that Kierkegaard was writing around 1843 is that they're by and large dedicated to his father, Michael Peterson Kierkegaard, which I think is significant. You don't see that in the other writings as much. Do you have anything to remark about that? Like why he may have went out of his way to dedicate these particular works to his father, where we don't see that in his other writings? Do you have any theory about that? Did that stick out to you at all, Robert?
Not really. I didn't really find anything too significant about that. Have other issues of why he wrote this and how he wrote this and how they were linked in, but not about that issue. So I'll let you go ahead.
I can understand why he would feel so indebted to his father, because it was his father's fortune that allowed him to be so prolific. You know, he wasn't burdened by a professorship, so he was able to write all 80 of these books with relatively little responsibility from family, children, financial responsibility. So I can understand. What I wonder is when his father actually passed away, I don't know if I need to look that up. I wonder if maybe this was part of his grieving process, if dedicating these books, or if his father was near the end of his life and he wanted to do something for his father. I don't know. But I just thought it was sort of significant. You don't see this in the other writings, but you see it in the discourses.
Yeah, that's a good point. They had a very close relationship, probably closer than most people have, because his life was so restricted in his youth. The only time he actually went out, according to some of the information we have, is when he went out for walks with his father. And his father was his idol as well, I believe. He used to listen to his father argue, or at least have discussions with the pastor and some other prominent people in the city. And he admired him so much. So that might be a good point to show admiration, yeah, his admiration, as well as his a way of him getting through his the grief process.
I think also it has something to do with the nature of Kierkegaard's authorship, because at this particular time, we're talking about a book that's in Kierkegaard's first authorship. And for those who don't know Soren Kierkegaard all that well, there are two major epochs in Soren's authorship, the first and the second authorship. And in that first authorship, we usually refer to that as the polyonymous authorship, meaning he had multiple aliases where he would write under pseudonyms. And then these upbuilding discourses generally attach themselves to the indirect signings. This would be a direct signing. So maybe Kierkegaard felt like it went antithetical to the spirit of the pseudonymous writings. I mean, obviously, if he dedicated those books, those pseudonymous books, to his father, his identity would have been given away immediately. It would have obscured the fact that he was trying to hide behind these masks. So when he did have an opportunity to sign something directly in these upbuilding discourses, he better take it. That was probably why we don't see that in the first authorship.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah, his identity would be like, I don't know, it'd be like Clark Kent telling everybody at the newspaper office that he was really Superman. You know, or like, yeah, coming in with the Superman cape on, like, oops. So some more so a little bit more background that I probably should include here is that, so today we're going to be addressing the two upbuilding discourses from 1843. And altogether, in like 5 installments, he wrote 18 upbuilding discourses over a span of 2 years. And they occur, these two that we're going to discuss today, the 3 from 1843 that I believe came out on the same day as Repetition, Fear, and Trembling. This one comes out around the same time as Either Or. I believe this came out on May 16th, 1843, and Either Or came out on February 20th, 1843, which is really incredible to think about him dropping 2, 3, 4 books at a time. And over the period of 1843 to 1845, in 5 installments, he wrote 2 upbuilding discourses, 3 upbuilding discourses, 4 upbuilding discourses, and then in 1844, 2 upbuilding discourses, 3 upbuilding discourses, and 4 upbuilding discourses. It's my hope, after today, we will have covered 5. And you see, CJ and Matt Brake and I did the 3 upbuilding discourses from 1843. It's my hope that eventually to cover all 18. Whether or not that's with you, that'll be up for you to decide, depending on how you feel about how today goes. What else do I want to say about any of this? I think I've covered all the sort of background material, aside from the fact that these upbuilding discourses show that Soren Kierkegaard was a religious author from the start. I think there's a temptation amongst people who know a little about Soren Kierkegaard, an in-between sort of state, to wonder aloud if Soren sort of evolved over the years. Was he an aesthete, then an ethical, then a knight of infinite resignation, and then a knight of faith? It's pretty obvious from these upbuilding discourses that are in the first authorship that he knew exactly what he was doing from the jump. So, and he was a religious author from the jump.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. As a matter of fact, when I first read these upbuilding discourses, I noticed they're considerably different than the rest of the writings that he has. Maybe due, like it says in the introduction, to his more directness. But I think they do address the religious sphere more directly, although he does include some of the ethical and the aesthetical. Actually, they come together more emphasize the religious. Also, the other thing I noticed that was interesting is, as I was reading the discourses, I saw seeds of a lot of his other works that he would go on in the future to develop, such as the idea of anxiety, the will of God, the separation from God and man's independence from God, this lack of seriousness that Christians had. All these he would go on to develop a lot more in some of his other writings. But interesting to see the seeds, especially since I had just done Purity of Heart. That was the last project. I saw so much of Purity of Heart in this as well. Do you see some of his other works in this?
Oh yeah, totally. And CJ and I, when we discuss these books in person, the analogy that we've used to discuss Soren is that we talk about him as having one big idea, and that's not to be pejorative. What we're trying to say there, we kind of describe Soren's big idea as this beautiful sculpture that's in a museum, and the individual, depending on their proximity to that sculpture, can marvel at a different aspect of its beauty. So I think Soren's generally, it's not like Soren's authorship is like talking about metaphysics over here and philosophy of science over here and philosophy of religion over here. I think it's always tied back to this idea of how our lives ultimately have meaning and are fulfilled in the relationship with Christ. But what that means varies from the differing vantage points. What I think is kind of interesting about Kierkegaard's authorship, though his ideas don't really seem to change, this one big idea just seems to be elaborated upon over and over and over again, is that his writing style, I believe, improves. Like I feel like these discourses, despite the fact that they are direct, are still, like, these were hard for me. I've read a lot of Kierkegaard, and I found these to be difficult. How did you find them?
I'm really glad you said that, because I found them the same way. When I started to read that, I found it as though I was listening to a dialogue. He was thinking at the same time he was writing, and it was kind of hard to outline it, because he would go over these ideas and thoughts, and then he'd go back again, kind of like a loop, and talk about them again, as though he was just writing them down as they were spilling off his mind. And it became difficult for me to try to collectively understand the work. So this would not be a work I would suggest a beginner go into if they want to really understand Kierkegaard. I think you could see a little bit, and I don't want to use the word immaturity, but lack of maturity that he gained later on in his ability to put his ideas together and down on paper. Would you agree with that?
It seems like, there are some books that I've covered recently that were just a real joy to research and cover. And it's not that there wasn't joy in this. It was just very, very difficult. And I find most of Kierkegaard to be very difficult, but there are, like, CJ and I recently did The Crisis and the Crisis of a Life and an Actress. And that felt like reading just literature. That just felt so breezy. It was like, I don't know. It felt like you're at the gym, and like you're like trying to lift all this weight, and then someone takes some weight off, and you don't even realize it, and you're like, whoa, that was easy. I felt like The Present Age was pretty easy to get through, I think. Yeah. Of the Lilies of the Field and the Birds of the Air, I felt was pretty easy to get through. And I felt like of the difference between a genius and apostle was pretty easy to get through. But these Upbuilding discourses are tough sledding. The discourses that I'm also working on, the 3 discourses on imagined occasions, those are tough to get through. They're almost as hard as, I would say, some stuff that I've been avoiding because of its difficulties, such as Philosophical Fragments, Concluding Unscientific Postscript, Sickness Unto Death. And so part of me is thinking, maybe I shouldn't be such a fraidy cat and take on the big boy stuff.
Well, can you imagine, though, that these were they really didn't have a good word to explain them other than discourse, but they were kind of like sermons. Can you imagine sitting in church and listening to him give this as a sermon? I probably be a pretty small church by the time he got done.
Yeah, but you know what? I wish I was there. And I know you do too.
Yeah.
And something that I found that's helped me, and I've never done this before. I'm for Noetic, I'm building up a reservoir of poetry lectures. I'm having a bunch of poetry experts teach me poetry as well. And I relate this story about how I read Goethe's Faust, and because Kierkegaard was obsessed with Faust, I read Goethe's Faust, and I didn't enjoy it, and I didn't understand why it was good. And I got so frustrated with a line in Goethe's Faust that I just angrily just like read it aloud, being like, this doesn't make any sense. And I read it aloud, and when the words hit my ears, I was like, that is beautiful. And I'm like, I've been doing this all wrong. I ought to be reading Faust out loud. And like the rest of Faust, I read it out loud and I loved it. I don't know about you, but these discourses I read aloud to myself as I'm studying them. And when they hit my ears, they become so beautiful. And I think if I just read it, I'd want to like gouge my eyes out maybe. But reading it aloud has helped me comprehend it so much better. Do you read aloud Kierkegaard? Because I never did that until these discourses.
Sometimes I read aloud. A lot of times I'll just kind of read the words word at a time, not necessarily coming through my mouth, but I focus on each word. I think that slows us down. A lot of times when we read, if we try to read it like the morning newspaper, we're looking for bullet items. But in Kierkegaard's works, especially in this, there's not a lot of bullet items. And if there are, a lot of the information that actually happens is between the bullet items. So you just don't want to go through and try to find the main points, because then you're going to miss a lot of the background information that he's giving you.
Yeah, and that's why I'm really happy to be doing this with you, because given the nature of what I'm trying to do with Noetic, I think I have the tendency to look for the bullet points, and I have a feeling you're going to put a lot of flesh and blood on this skeleton. Before I get a little bit more into it, you already sort of mentioned that these were like sermons, and I've said this in other podcasts and recordings, that the reason why we say that they're like sermons is that Kierkegaard didn't believe that they could qualify as sermons because he didn't have the authority, the post to say that they were sermons, and they were really discourses for that reason. And he says it's interesting is that he's not really trying to get everyone in the church. He's trying to talk to my reader, his reader, the single individual. And what's ironic about all of this is that he just tried to reach out to that one person. And think about how many people have coalesced around his authorship and how many people he's brought to Christ as a result of just focusing on a single person. And you think about how many people who have tried to convert stadiums of people and how many people they've run off from Christ. You know, it's very ironic that Kierkegaard would go for the person and get so many devoted people, and, you know, other individuals are trying to convert people en masse and turning people off to Christianity in droves.
I think we'll probably get into that when we discuss the difference between wishing faith and willing faith. I think that'll probably become clearer.
I'll have to probably, you seem to be on top of that. I might have to hand that part of the show over to you. Did you want to say anything else about the preface before we get into the prayer and to the meat of the first discourse?
Well, it was interesting how they're paired together with, I think you touched on that a little bit, that either or was paired along with these two upbuilding discourses. And it's not only that, but these discourses involve not only either or, but also scripture verses such as Galatians or from James.
I did. And, you know, and what's interesting about that, Robert, is that I actually, on the Noetic app and on the SoundCloud page for this, I did readings from the King James of those Bible passages. So individuals can reference those. They can listen. I recommend people listening to those before they go into these discourses. So in the cache, the Bible verses will be first, and then this will come right after it. So they'll be familiarized with that. Unless okay. Do you have them on hand? You don't by chance have them on hand, do you?
I have a Bible program on hand that I bring up. Is that? Oh, did you want me to read the verses? I have some of them embedded in my notes when we get to them. We'll see.
Yeah. Okay. Then let's just do that. And
yeah, it's a little bit lengthy. but and sometimes it's easier if people read it on their own. They can read it at
Okay.
a different pace. But I found trying to keep all these three things in my mind as I was reading it for about the third time, thinking, okay, how does this match up with James? How does it match up with either or? And it was kind of difficult to see because it's like watching a three-ring circus. I didn't know exactly where to put my focus. So it took a few times to get through this to finally say, oh, now I make the connection to either or. Oh, now I see the connection to the scriptures. It took several readings for me. How many times did you read this?
I only read it once, and I took notes as I went. Okay. So I would imagine that you have a richer, deeper understanding of it. My experience has been, and I tell this to anyone who's studying philosophy, that if you really want to know what a text is saying, especially a very difficult one, to read it at least 2 times. So I kind of violated my own rule by only reading it once. I like to think that the fact that I take such meticulous notes as I go makes up for the fact that I only read it once. It's also because I'm trying to juggle 3 other seminars with this. So, one day I can revert back to my old standing procedure. But that's what you're here for, to fill me in.
Well, I hope so. And the final thing I was going to say in the introduction was that how I particularly interpret Kierkegaard is through my own life's experiences. I don't see him as a philosopher just spouting off philosophical phrases and so forth. I try to take what he's singing and translate it through my own life's experiences. So maybe each of us will see Kierkegaard a little differently, depending upon your life experiences and mine. And that would be great that here we can have the dialogue and see how each of us sees it differently.
Yes, I think if I can just sort of show my hand a little bit, I think I could probably say something about my own personal psychology that tends to catastrophize the future. I think it's a gift in some ways because I think it allows me to be a man of vision, but I think it also is something that makes it so that keeps me up at night. I think about all that could go wrong and all the negative expectancy and how I need to learn how to have the expectancy of faith, which we'll talk about in this first discourse.
Yeah, that's perfect. I think we're on base there. So I guess we're ready to get into the text a little bit.
Yeah. So the first discourse starts off with this expectancy of faith on New Year's Day. It's interesting. He tries to kind of paint this picture of the very special feeling we feel like when a calendar year turns over, and we feel like we're in a real transition where there's a lot of possibility and we're closing the door on a lot of things. And he starts off with a prayer. And I thought it was a very interesting sort of prayer at the beginning, and maybe you can say more about it after I kind of go through a few things about it. It starts off with a prayer about New Year's Day, and he's saying thanks in this prayer for a new year. What's interesting is that as he thinks about the new year, he's kind of filled with a lot of anxiety about all the bad things that could happen in the new year, all the sin that he could commit in the new year, all the ways that he could err. But he's also comforted by the fact that he knows that he's accountable to God. And because he so fervently believes in God, he also believes in God's mercy. So though he knows that he will make mistakes, he knows so long as he clings to God that God will in some way forgive him for those mistakes that are made. And that this somehow helps us get a handle on the anxieties about our sin. And what's really amazing is that we have access to the same God, every individual, regardless of your station in life, be you Abraham or a Rockefeller or a vagrant on the street, all have access to the same God. And then this calming of the anxiety about future indiscretions and past ones, I suppose, as well, the guilt that convicts from that, is a really beautiful thing, and that's kind of how our prayer starts off in this first Upbuilding Discourses. Would you like to add anything to that?
I think he did a great job on that. The only thing I noticed that the prayer was addressed as a we prayer. It was a collective prayer. It wasn't I. It was based on the pronoun we, which kind of brings the reader into it. So it's a prayer that we're all saying, not just he's saying. So it was just kind of an interesting choice of pronouns, I thought, on his part, to bring the reader in.
Yeah, what's interesting in the three discourses on imagined occasions doing, there's a passage in there where he talks about how there is no real fame to be attributed in that book, that really when the author and the reader experience that book together, a new sort of thing comes into existence, where Kierkegaard begins and where end ceases to be. And it's really a dynamic sort of conversation. And I think that's probably the same nature of these discourses, is that that we're not just sort of getting these insights from some sort of like directly dialed into this process. That Kierkegaard's consciousness, his own concerns over anxiety and sin, are ones that parallel and harmonize with our own.
Yeah.
So then the second part of the first Upbuilding Discourse, it's entitled "The Epistle the Apostle Paul Writes to the Galatians, chapter 3, verse 23 to the end," which I believe is to the 29th verse. And I went over that this morning and trying to remember what my recall's not so great. You might want to take this. In general, what does Galatians say there?
I believe that what he's talking about is the relationship that you had with the law, and how he had to approach God through the law, and that the comparison of the law to Christ, the freedom that we have with Christ, compared to the law, obedience to the law. I think he explains it as he goes through it, though. It's easier to, if we sit and read that alone, we'll probably come to our own conclusions. I think he kind of takes us in a little different direction than the way most of the theologians and commentators I've read interpret those. So the way he does it, I think it's a little different. So
that I read the passage and I went over it, and the passage is something to the effect of like, well, before Christ, God gave the Jews the law, and that was sort of how faith was exercised. And then when Christ came, faith wasn't just something for the Jewish people. Faith was something that everyone could have, Gentile or Jew, man or woman, skin color, nothing. That essentially that there's no more chosen people, that all of humanity is who Christ is interested in. That was the general sort of takeaway that I got, that Christ sort of shatters the law so that everyone can come and live with him. Yeah. But do you think that's an unorthodox interpretation?
Oh, no. The way I see it, and it's probably complementary to what you're saying, is that the law, he was talking about the law and the schoolmaster, which was one of the words that he uses in here, that the law taught the Jew up to a certain point, and then when Christ came in, he took it the rest of the way, kind of. The interpretation that I put into that is that the law taught man two things. It taught him about man's sinfulness. It was a witness to man's sinfulness, not living up to the law. And at the same time, it taught man of God's righteousness, because God, was kind of embodied in the law. But it was a textual version of the law. It was something that was written. So it was kind of written on stone, I think you might say. That there was no real life in the law.
But very legalistic.
Yeah, it was legalistic. And so it was easy for men to take that and to try to live according to this monolithic law. instead, and see it only as one thing, only as a way to become righteous, rather than as evidence of their unrighteousness and evidence of God's righteousness. So they started to miss the point, seeing it, this is my way to faith, I'll just obey the law. And then the Pharisees came along and had to add to it and had to clarify things, and it became this horrendous idea. But with Christ, he kind of does the same thing that the law did. He witnesses to our sinfulness. If you ever read the Sermon on the Mount, you ought to be aware of your sin, made aware that you can't live up to this. But at the same time, he makes us aware of God's righteousness. So he plays the same role as the law, except he's living and he's alive. And in the end, he brings grace and mercy. If we don't, and the problem with the Pharisees, and even today in some of the churches, is that if we don't understand our guilt, then how can we understand grace? The more we understand how guilty we are, the more valuable God's grace becomes. So that's one of the things that Kierkegaard brings to us that not many other writers do. And people don't want to focus on that part, about being sinful. It's not comfortable, doesn't make us happy. But the joy isn't that half. The joy is in the half of now recognizing the salvation comes through Christ, because we're seeing not only the law of God, we're not only seeing the righteousness of God, but we're seeing his grace and his forgiveness. So he brings that whole other sphere, that whole other level, what Kierkegaard calls the religious sphere.
Yeah. It's I'm so steeped in the Kierkegaard, I forget how alien it is in our culture to speak of sin. Like I'm very comfortable with it, but like I remember, if I were to have these conversations in the wider world, people be like, "Oh my God, Luke's some sort of religious zealot talking about sin all the time." I think the thing has always been sort of intriguing to me, and it's a little bit of a sidetrack from the text, but I think it's an interesting one nonetheless. Is that Kierkegaard is prone to speak of sin in different ways. If we talk about how the law made prior to Christ individuals aware of sin, it seems like it only made them aware of a type of sin, maybe an ethical type of sin, because it's in the relationship to the incarnation that perhaps the total depravity of the human race and of the individual, not just generally, is really understood. I think maybe with the law or with ethical constructs or things like that, we understand what it means to assert our individuality in a negative way against ethical mores, like we see in Fear and Trembling and maybe with the law and stuff like that. But it's that somehow in the instant, the encounter with Christ, there's something more about the radical depravity of man that comes to light. And I think part of it is getting over the righteousness, that can come about from having a good grasp of religious law or ethics can actually blind us to our own sin. We can think ourselves to be so great that we can't really find within what needs to be accounted for and what needs to be confessed to God. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. I was just jotting down here. You've read I think it's in the Concept of Despair. Have you read that? The concept of
dread or anxiety?
Anxiety. Yeah, dread or anxiety. I think in there, he tells us, he defines sin for us in a little different way. He tells us that sin is that separation from God caused by man's desire to be to be independent of God. And sin is that state where man is exercising his independence from God. He's saying, I don't need you, I can do it myself. The actual objects of sin, the deeds that we do, are only signs of sin. The actual sin has a source, and that's our separation from God, which brings about that anxiety. So that was one of my favorite works of him, the concept of anxiety.
I need to go back over that. I think I got a lot of it. One of my favorite texts has been The Sickness Unto Death, where he does a typology of despair and sin there, very explicitly sort of enumerates the different species of sin and despair, and equates sin with despair, which I think is a really fascinating concept.
Right.
So, yeah. So, man, it's great to be able to talk with someone so fluent in Kierkegaard, because it's like having a double. It's nice.
I'm not sure I live up to that, but I'll accept that as a compliment.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. It's a very high scholarly conversation, which I'm enjoying. So, in this, shortly after the epistle is referenced or read or whatever, he talks about how everyone is assembled in quiet reflection on the new year. And I think I may have alluded to this already about how the indefinite nature of the future makes Kierkegaard and others restless, especially those who possess good fortune, who are counting on, to continue to amass that fortune, or concerned about how to secure it or whatever. And there's this quote from pages 10 through 11, and he says, about faith, there's a different kind of talk. It's said to be the highest good, the most beautiful, the most precious, the most blessed riches of all, not to be compared with anything else, incapable of being replaced. And that this really is the highest good, not all the things that fortune can bestow upon a man. And it's actually the thing that's capable of smothering that anguish about how to make sure that one's affairs are always in order. I think the question he tries to take up, and I might be proceeding a little quickly here, the question is, why are so few people, if God is the same God for Abraham and the person on the street and the person in the palace, I think what tends to happen is that individuals think that if this faith, this God is so available to me all the time, does it really have any value? Like, why ought I obtain this thing that the common beggar has access to smother the anguish and anxiety about whatever could happen in the coming year? And that this is one of the reasons why people probably don't enter into the faith relationship. They think that if anything's going to be have value, it's got to be something really difficult to obtain or exclusive or something they can buy their way into or something. What did you make of all of this?
Yeah, that and also what I kind of jotted down is that a lot of people have the idea of it. What good is faith? I have to judge faith by what it'll do for me. What am I going to get out of this? Yeah, it's okay, God, I'll believe in you, but what are you going to do for me? Kind of attitude. And that is definitely the wrong approach.
Why is that wrong? Why is that wrong? And we'll see that in James a little bit more in the discussion of that. And I thought that was what was really good about the passage he chose from James in the second discourse. But I didn't really understand what this notion of tempting God was. And maybe you can, yeah, there's some, by like, well, what can God do for me? What can God do for me? And this is kind of like you're trying to enter into this wager with the eternal creator of things to somehow like, okay, well, if you believe in me, then I'll sort of enter into this reciprocal relationship. And how that's kind of a profane mockery of God on some level.
What we're doing is we're bringing God down to our level as though he's somebody that we can negotiate with. And there's a lot of books out there today that are what would I say, are making a lot of money or selling a lot of copies, using that as their basic idea that God is our equal, he's our friend, and we can negotiate the kingdom of heaven along with him. I'll do this for you if you do this for me. And I think Kierkegaard gets into this, that after a while, when you find you can't negotiate with God, it brings you to that sense of despair, that anxiety, which leads you to the despair. And you realize this is a delusion. I can't make a deal with God. I'm not in a position, I don't have anything to give God of any equality that could possibly be as important and valuable as his love and his righteousness and his grace.
Right. And I want to clarify a few things here. Just because God is accessible to everyone doesn't mean that it is a venture that is done easily. There is adversity. And I think you've talked about it to some degree already. What that adversity constitutes is that when we enter into this sort of relationship with God, there might be this temptation to try to tempt God, to get him to come down to our level and be like, oh God, if you just make this happen, then I'll totally change my ways and this and that. So God doesn't necessarily bestow blessings upon our life in that way. And that's part of the adversity and the struggle and trying to really constantly appropriate and generate the faith relationship with God. But there are going to be things that God does give us. It's just that it's not going to be tangible necessarily. It's going to be, it's more about God coming to live within us. It's going to be more about the love that we feel within ourselves from God when we repent and we get that alleviation from the despair that is afflicting us. And I think that's what Kierkegaard might be trying to attune us to, is that there is something to be gained from God, but it is a completely internal thing, and it's there with us through the good times and the bad times. It's there with us when we celebrate financial gains, and it's there for us when we're thrown into solitary confinement. And that's the beautiful thing about it too, is that no man can take it from us. Like it doesn't matter if we are tortured and imprisoned or we've lost the ability to speak, like we can always have God within us. Yeah. No person can take it away, but also no person can give it to us. It's all up to the individual.
Yeah, and that's what I think this is about here. We get into that. A lot of times people think of the relationship with God as objective, which is what Kierkegaard goes into. And for me, what that means is we see God as giving us something, giving me salvation, giving me comfort, giving me something. And we see that all as some objects. But Kierkegaard reminds us what God actually gives us is himself. It's a subjective giving. He gives us himself. And what does he accept from us? What does he expect from us? Not objects, not sacrifices. He expects us to give ourselves to him. So it's a total subjective relationship with God, not an objective relationship with God of I'll do this for you and you do this for me. And Kierkegaard helps us to see it. That he helped me to see that relationship on that level, on that totally subjective level. I'm giving you me, God, and I'm accepting you as a person. Do you see that?
I completely do. And do you mind if I ask you a personal question? You can decline if you don't feel like it.
I'm an open book.
So a lot of people ask me, they say, well, Luke, you're only a Christian because you want to go to heaven. People will say this to me. And or other people will say something to the effect of, well, I don't like Christians because they condemn other people and say that this person's destined for this eternal destination or not. And I'm just kind of curious because, I've never asked you this question. Our relationship has developed through these webinars or whatever we're calling these that we're doing together. I've never had a chance to ask you this. I don't think about what's going to happen to me when I die. And I think Kierkegaard says this somewhere. I'm trying to remember where, but he says something to the effect of, if he died and he saw that everyone else ascended to heaven, but he was still left in hell, he would still praise God's justice. I have no idea if God wants me in heaven or anywhere else, or if he wants me to live on beyond this life. It doesn't even matter to me. I don't know about you, but by studying all this Kierkegaard, all that matters is that God and I are contemporaneous now. All that matters to me is that I feel like God is available now and that I'm imitating him now. I don't think about anything else. Maybe, I don't know. I've just never talked to anyone else about this. Is what I'm saying totally alien to you, or how do you feel?
As a matter of fact, when we get into expectancy, I see a lot of the answer to that question in the second part of this expectancy. But for me personally, I'm 100% with you. I feel that I really don't deserve the kingdom of heaven. I feel that because of my past sins, that there's no way I can get there because I'm such a nice guy. Okay,
Yeah.
because my history is kind of a burden, and it keeps my feet on the ground. Maybe it lets me know that I'm saved by grace, not by anything I've done, most certainly. And it's that grace that helps me to want to share that grace with other people. And as you, I don't know for sure. And this is a difficult issue because I can't say for sure I know I'm going to heaven, but at the same time I shouldn't question that, because that's God's promise to me. So right now in my life, I'm at kind of that difficult issue where I know I'm supposed to claim it, but yet I just am still burdened with my sense that I don't deserve it. But I do what I do because he deserves it. He is the greatest thing. God is the greatest one, the greatest thing. His love is the greatest thing. And I want to share that with other people, and I guess we'll kind of get through that same idea as we further progress. But that's how I look at it right now. I can't say I'll always see it that way, but right now I see it that way, that God is worthy. And he's worthy of my love, and I want other people to see that same thing, regardless of what happens to me in the scheme of things.
Yeah, but I never find, like, I've had plenty of family members pass and friends pass, and I never think about, I don't know. I don't think about, I don't have a lot of heaven on my mind.
No, not in the next life to come, but the subject of that book that I wrote, Kingdom in Your Midst. That's what I wanted to cover there, that the kingdom is right here. This is, the gate is here, the door is here. It's not the pearly gates in heaven. That we go through the kingdom right now through our confession, through our repentance, and through changes of life. We enter in now. And so we don't have to worry about the future so much because we're in it right now. So the future will come, and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad we share that perspective, because a lot of people have told me they think that my perspective of that's very weird. But again, I guess we're finding more convergence on this. They're just like, what? You're a Christian, but you're not concerned about damning people and playing ping pong with Ben Franklin in heaven? No, I'm not. I always say that's way above my pay grade.
Yeah.
So we should turn to this expectancy of faith. And he talks there about, what are the faithful expecting, in a sense, like, what are they sort of occupied with in the future? And he says that, this becomes like a real anxiety inducing thing about where people are going to go if they should die, or what they're going to do with their lives. And that generally there are two sort of secular sort of responses to this. And I see this a lot amongst a lot of young people, and maybe it never goes away. Maybe you still see it through other stages of life, and you can say something to this. But he talks about one of those routes for people sort of dealing with an unknown future and the anguish and anxiety that it brings is to just irresponsibly relinquish it. This whole, like, eat and drink and be merry sort of mentality, to live totally in the moment. I see that amongst a lot of young people, and a lot of young people sort of implore me to do more spontaneous things, to be more adventurous, to engage in more wanderlust and things like that. And then when I talk to them, they seem pretty miserable. I don't know. Does that, how do you understand that? Or does it ever go away? Is it a symptom of youth, or what was your take on how Kierkegaard said that was one of the sort of secular responses to people thinking about the future?
Yeah, I think your take is really great on that. I went in a different direction on that, but I understand, and I think you're right, that when people look at the future, they see it as something they don't want to worry about. They just kind of live in the moment, live in the present. Like you said, eat, drink, and be merry. And not to worry about what's going to happen. I see it. Maybe I focus a little bit more on the church, and I see a lot of people thinking about the future more than the present, in the sense of just what we were talking about. Christians will say, "Well, I'm looking forward to the rapture, and my whole faith, everything is wrapped up when Jesus comes." And they spend so much time on that, they forget their present, and they forget their present circumstances, worrying about what happens in the rapture rather than worrying about their present state of holiness and getting their act together here and now. So it's kind of like a deferral. They're deferring into the future rather than worrying about the present. So I see both things happening. We either ignore the future or we take it too seriously. I think he says that, and here, as to how much concern should we give to the future. In your case, you're saying they don't care about it at all. And in my case, I'm saying they care about it too much.
Yeah. I can't tell you.
Where do we put the line?
Yeah. I can't tell you the number of people who have told me that they're like, they said something along the lines of like, I'm a gypsy. I'm like, if someone tells me that they're a gypsy, I think I'm just kind of like, yeah, that says to me that you might be kind of lost and sort of aimless. But with individuals that are sort of taking the future so seriously, when they're sort of waiting on the apocalypse or the second coming or something like that, do you see their lot? Like when I see these irresponsible life views, bad choices are made. It's all there's not a great deal of cognition about ramifications of future actions and stuff like that. If there are people who are sort of waiting for Jesus to come again, are their lives equally frivolous as a result of sort of looking for external signs of the gospel to come true? I mean, you'd probably be throwing some people under the bus. I am too. I'll live with it. I mean, it seems to encourage a pretty frivolous mindset amongst the more secular carpe diem set.
Yeah, one of the things I think that it does, and again, maybe to make it clear, I'm not speaking about everybody who believes in the rapture, but I'm saying that we have to be careful that when we take on such a theology, when we put so much into that one aspect of theology, it affects how we think about other things. I think some of the people that I've met are not worried about their state of holiness right now, so they feel it's okay to go out and do things that maybe are even immoral because they're forgiven, and when the rapture comes, everything is going to be okay. God's going to forgive them for all their sins, so it's okay to go out and do these things right now, rather than focus a little bit more and thinking maybe I need to express that holiness now instead of wait for it.
Yeah, so it seems like it encourages frivolity in that scenario as well.
It does too. Yeah. So how do we get around all that? Is the question that he's going to try to answer for. He talks about faith. The way we should tackle it is to be victorious over faith.
Yeah, because otherwise, if we're not victorious, because he says the other response to it, right, is that we just become utterly incapacitated by the future, right? That it encourages such anxiety. And I wanted to think about what could possibly be an example of that, like just like someone who's just so hamstrung about what they're going to do with their life. They're not sort of surrendering the responsibility, but they just toss and turn, are made restless by the different sort of ways that they the different sort of routes that they can go with their life. It's almost like a paralysis by analysis. I see this a lot in individuals, especially young people in their 20s and 30s, who are just like, what am I supposed to do with myself? Like, what does God want out of me? What am I supposed to do? There's this constant just sort of hand-wringing and not knowing what direction to go. And therefore they never really set sail. And I could probably be said to be guilty of this at some point in my life as well. I'm speaking from experience. But I think that's another sort of response to the anguish of not knowing the future outside of Christ.
Yeah, and look at the history of today. I think we can make it even more pragmatic. What do we have to look forward to today historically? Look at what's happening. We've got Korea doing their thing, China, we've got ISIS, we've got all sorts of things going on. What's going to happen in the future? Atomic warfare. There's so much out there in our current events that we can certainly have anxiety over the future. So how do we conquer that kind of, what do we tell people when they come to us and say, well, what are we going to do? What's going to happen? I'm so worried about the future. We're going to tell them everything's going to be rosy, because we don't know.
No, we don't. I mean, it's probably what engenders a lot of this perspective of building bunkers. And I mean, look, I think about it in terms of, if we want to tie it to topical things, like I notice every once in a while it creeps into my mind, we have a lot of these mass shootings now. The wake of Orlando. I know a guy who was playing drums for the band that was entertaining people when the shooting in Paris happened. And it's just, it's really close. I believe here in Northern Virginia last week, the FBI intercepted somebody who was planning on doing something. Of course, we're not going to hear about that a lot because they were actually able to prevent him. But, you can't, sometimes I wonder if like, I'm just going to become a shut-in, because anytime I go out in the public, I'm like, oh, this could be it. This library, this pool, this thing, this could be where it all goes down for me.
Yeah. So the future can bring us anxiety. And if we have nothing, I think this is what he was getting at. If we have nothing stable to look at, and I think you maybe you wanted to speak to the idea of the sailor, the reference that he makes to the sailor out on the ocean. Do you want to go ahead and do that?
Yeah, sure. He talks about how in ancient mariner times, what the sailors would do in order for them to properly chart a course but that they would look to the eternal. And to them, we have a greater understanding of the cosmic perspectives. Stars aren't eternal; they die out. But that from their perspective, they could always rely on the stars, even because they were operating on a different level of time. He says, by the eternal, one can conquer the future, because the eternal is the ground of the future, and therefore through it the future can be fathomed. This is page 19 of the first Upbuilding Discourse. Uh-huh. And I think that's what this expectancy of the future becomes sort of this expectancy of victory. I'm trying to understand how all these sort of concepts interlock. It's in the sense that, like, if we're guiding everything by our relationship to that which is the true eternal, the known God through Jesus, because you can't really know God without Jesus for Kierkegaard. He's just kind of this great sort of unknown. If you don't have that, you can't put the future to rest, so that you can dwell in the moment and live it in a rich and full and holy way. It's almost, yeah. So, I'm probably doing a really terrible idea of explicating it. Let's see if you're a little bit more eloquent at stating about how he thinks all these different things fit together.
The way I had to read this and go over it and really think about this area a lot as to what his point was here, because I felt that was definitely important. The past, present, and the future is the eternal. The eternal, when we think of eternal, we mean the past, present, and the future. It continues on. And that's how we have to think of God. When we have faith in God, we're throwing our faith into the eternal, which supersedes past, present, and future. A better word I had was transcend. So when we're focused on God, past, present, and future are no longer really relative to our presence, our being. Our faith exists in the eternal. We just live it out in the present. But the future is no longer something to worry about because it's taken care of within the eternal. So I don't, we were talking about the future, worrying about the future. I don't think about the future. I think more about my eternal God, and that all this is under his guidance. So there's no longer a fear of the future. Well, it also does another thing too that I've tried to teach in my Bible study, is that it brings the past, present, and future together. It's like there's no time. So what happened back in the Old Testament with the law is contemporary with us today, and will always be contemporary. It's all faith. So the law, those who had faith under the law are equal to those who have faith today, and will also be equal to those who have faith tomorrow. When we have communion every Sunday, or whenever you have it, it's not just a communion of the people in that building at that one single moment. It's communion with those people all over the world and all through history. Everybody who's ever celebrated it, it's that same moment, because there is no past, present, and future in faith.
That's something I wonder. We don't become gods in faith. In other parts of Kierkegaard will speak about how that we sort of further appropriate subjective truth and we get closer to the truth object. But really, Christ was the truth, and so there's always going to be some difference. We're always we can't turn ourselves into Christ. But I wonder if there's sort of a faint sort of imprint from the fact that we're interacting with something from an internal perspective. If we say, because everything occurred from an internal perspective, everything has already sort of happened or is contemporaneously present. And I wonder if we are linking up to that thing which is eternal, that the past and the present and the future kind of fall away and become just sort of one instant. So like whereas mankind of sort of projects out everything, and I sort of see it as sort of triangulated where there's everything that's an instance for the eternal. If accordion like collapse happens with the linear sketch of time, and we too are made this just this present moment, if the future and the past no longer really mean anything for us.
Yeah, that's how I see it. That's what I think Kierkegaard is telling us here about the eternal. That's how we conquer the future. And it's interesting he uses that term conquer.
I love it.
We have to have armor. We have to have the right armor to enter into the future. Like, hey, this is something to really be afraid of here. And then he kind of tells us that you can have victory over it, and that's by willing the future, willing the eternal, I guess we might say. I know it might be a little backtracking, but can we get a little bit back into the difference between willing and wishing? That was really the first section. Yeah, we kind of skipped over that.
Yeah, please do. Please do. Well, say what you would like to say.
Well, as he speaks about, where is it? I can pick that up here. He was trying to help someone very dear to him into faith, and he didn't know how he could do this. He thought he could wish the person into faith, or maybe pray the person into faith. If I say the right prayers, if I say them enough, if I'm really sincere, maybe God will grant this person the gift of faith. And as he continues to do this, he finds failure. Nothing happens. There's no change. And he gets very frustrated. And he kind of even despairs over it until he finally realizes that you can't wish somebody into faith. Because if you could, then you'd be taking the place of Christ. You would be you would become the mediator between God and man, which is not for you to do. This was the temptation of God, is to make God who you wanted him to be. Instead of God being who he was, is to say, this is who I want you to be. Tempting him to change. But when this individual realizes that he couldn't do that, he then became aware that this is all part of the process of learning. This is all part of the process of learning what faith really is. And then he comes up with this thing that it's not, faith is not something you wish, it's something that you will. And when I realized that, I had to go and try to think, well, what's really the difference between wishing something and willing something? A lot of times we say it and we mean the same thing. But I think Kierkegaard is using it in the context that to wish something is to be something external. In other words, you go to bed at night and you say, I wish there's a new car in the driveway when I get up in the morning. And you go out and you don't see one, but you say, oh, no big deal. Because a wish doesn't require any responsibility. It doesn't require any giving of yourself, any commitment. It's just kind of, I'm divorced from the situation and I'm just separated. I want to wish, but I don't want to do anything to get it. And I don't want any responsibilities. I just want that new car in the driveway in the morning. But willing takes on Kierkegaard's, the leap. I'm leaping into something. I'm willing it, meaning regardless of whatever responsibility I have to do is fine with me. This is what I really want, is I want to will myself into faith. I'm accepting God's will under any conditions. So this is, I think, how he finally concludes for us that we have to will ourselves into faith, not just wait. I know too many people that have come to me and say they want more faith. And so they're just sitting around waiting for God to give them more faith. And they don't they don't get more faith. And they say, well, it's not my fault. It's God's fault because he's not giving me the faith.
What's interesting in the three discourses on imagining occasions, if Kierkegaard says that if anyone has really, truly tried to have the stillness before God and not received it, they either are sad and melancholic because it wasn't bestowed upon them, and they don't go around blaming God, or they recognize that they're not doing it right. They don't go around saying, oh, well, I don't have the God gene, or God's withholding faith from me. He says, if anyone's really, really tried, you will either get it, be crestfallen and silent about it, or you'll just keep trying at it until you get it right.
Right.
But anyone who goes around is like, yeah, I've tried that whole prayer thing. It's not for me. And Kierkegaard's going to be like, BS, you didn't really try.
Yeah. But and we have biblical examples of willing. We have Jesus saying, not my will, but your will. He wills his will to the superior will of God's will. His inferior will, he's willing to his Father. And even in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. So again, we have that submissiveness of our will to God's will. So that's an important feature that I didn't want to miss in his writings, the idea of willing ourselves to God rather than wishing it would come along, wishing faith would come along, wishing salvation would come along. We have to take what Kierkegaard called that leap of faith. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. On page 22, I like including quotes where I can, because I think Kierkegaard's such a beautiful writer, and I know you do too.
Yeah.
On page 22, he says, When you talk about many victories, you are like the person who talks about the many necessities. Only one thing is needful, and faith expects victory. And I really like that. You're talking about how, and I try to do that. And maybe this relates to the work that you've done on Kierkegaard's purity of heart and how it's to will one thing. It's very hard for me to, with a project of this nature, not to get a bunch of different competing motives in my ear. And I think for me, I just have to keep coming back to that recognition of God's sovereign will, and just whatever else happens, that's success, not no success or anything like that. But I think that correlates to this idea of wishing, of like, well, I wish I had this perfect marriage, or I wish I had this car, or I had this. He's like, no, that's silly vanity. There's really only the one thing that you need, and you need to conquer the future by having the trusting faith in God. Everything else is not really a need.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I think it's interesting. Shortly after that quote from page 22, we talk about a little bit of the adversity someone may experience as the result of feeling like they have conquered the future with faith, and how someone might try to sow doubt into them. The expectancy of faith, the conquering of the future, allows it so that we don't experience sort of a dissolution into multiplicity of wishing for sailboats and McMansions and a bunch, all that nonsense. But the doubting person says, well, look, like, what do you make of this expectancy of faith or whatever if like everything is taken away from you in the world? Like the person that's trying to doubt you or get you to doubt and to rip you out of this delusion is like, well, look, that's all fine and good. You can say that, but then like, what if you have a Job experience? Where do you stand then? Can you maintain this expectancy of victory? And I think this is kind of interesting. I think Kierkegaard says something to the effect of that there's no real loss if the world, and you've lived longer than I have and lived longer in faith than I have, and maybe you can say something to this, but if the world does take things away from us, it doesn't do anything to our feelings about faith, because it gives us an opportunity to cling that much more to God and to let us know if we really loved God for the right reasons, or if we were loving God because it was convenient and it seemed like he was giving us blessings. Mm-hmm. I don't know, I've always sort of identified as a Christian person, but to have this sort of existential Christian perspective is a relatively new one for me. I think for a long time I was looking for Christ in philosophy. I was looking for him objectively or speculatively and trying to prove him as the result of demonstrations or something like that. And then a couple of years ago, I found Kierkegaard and entered into a more subjective understanding of a relationship with Christ and sort of understood the impotence of that prior pursuit. But maybe, I don't know, I worry a little bit. I mean, I have been tested, but I don't know if I've really been brought to my knees since I've made this more authentic conversion to Christianity. So I may not be the authority to speak on it. I'd like to think that I would grow that much closer to God, but I don't know. Can you say anything about adversity and what Kierkegaard's saying here about that connection?
Well, I think this is when we talk about that, and suffering, we probably get into what I was talking about, personal experiences that we get through them, and then maybe we look at them later on. As far as suffering goes, I think they're contextual. I think when we suffer, we tend to be forced into thinking in the sense of the immediate. This is happening right here and now to me, and everything else is just kind of in the background. Everything else is a shadow. The most important thing to me right now is getting out of this suffering, and that's a distraction. it takes our mind off that eternal idea. The eternal concept is, it appears to be suffering now, but the worst thing is not the suffering, it's the meaninglessness that seems to be attached to it. Why am I suffering? It's as though if I had some significant reason, it would kind of make it okay. I mean, it'd still be hurtful, it would still be painful, but it would at least give me some context to why I'm going through this. So without that context, the suffering, I think, takes on a different meaning to us. It takes on the sense that we tend to think of ourselves as victims under those conditions. Our focus is on the present, and we're being conquered, in a sense, by the situation. What we have to do is see the suffering in the context of the eternal God, to know that we're going through this for a reason, that God does have a plan for the suffering. Maybe the suffering is to make us better Christians, or maybe the suffering is to make someone else a better Christian. Sometimes people might admire you because you're going through suffering and yet you maintain your faith. And that is an extremely important witness for some people who think, what am I going to do for God? How am I going to witness for God? Well, you witness in your suffering. We also have to see, and this came up in some of your podcasts before, Jesus' suffering. Suffering is a communion. It's something that almost like a touchstone, that I'm going through suffering and I can relate to Jesus now more clearly because he went through suffering. And so if he did it and I'm doing it, it's like almost like a communion where suffering becomes that point of contact. And I know you mentioned before one time, the puzzle is, well, if he's the Son of God, why did he suffer? You know, why would he go through such a thing? For that very reason, because he's human and he's bringing us together with him. At probably the most intimate thing we can do is suffer together. That's one of the most, everybody wants to have communion. They want to have a little wine. They want to have a little piece of bread. And for them, that's communion. But there's a transcendent communion, and that's the communion of suffering. And Paul did write about this. It's just not preached. But Paul wrote about, we're all suffering together. This is a communion that we have for those who love God. This is an expectation that you're going to suffer. And through the suffering, we become closer to one another and we become closer to God. So this was all part of Christ's suffering as a perfect man. He was being an example, showing us what must we do? Suffer. On the cross, this is probably the most challenging question. Why does he say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Right? That's probably one of the questions that paramount in people's minds. Is this was the last possible temptation that Satan could give to Christ, to make him deny his faith, to make him deny his Father. He took everything away from him. Jesus on the cross, he had no personal things. He lost everything. He lost his friends. They all ran away. He lost his future, in the sense he had nothing left to give God. But the one thing the devil couldn't take away was his faith. And so the last thing Jesus says on the cross is, into your hands I commit my spirit. The very last act of Jesus was an act of faith. And that's the example. He does that because he's saying, I'm a human and I am a perfect human, and this is what I expect perfect humans to do, is with their very last breath, give their faith to God if you have nothing left. And so for me, that's how I put suffering into perspective. Jesus, he went through it for us. And so we can go through it with him. We can kind of tie ourselves right into the cross through our own individual suffering. Does that make sense to you? Does that ring true to you too?
It does, and it's really poetic and really moving, but it opens up a host of philosophical issues. I think the one for me that I would want to explore closer as I go deeper into understanding or trying to understand theology is, if I think of Christ being a perfect individual, how he would be even susceptible to the temptation of Satan, just like you and I would be. The fact that he does ultimately, his last utterance is an utterance of faith, but the penultimate one is one where he's questioning the plan. And you're saying that Satan could get at that. I'm not saying it's incoherent or anything like that, but it does present something paradoxical, which may be totally fine given, Kierkegaard's love of paradoxes, about how Christ could even get inside, or how Satan could even get inside the mind of Christ. And then, there are further philosophical issues about, if there is a Trinity, how there's something that the Son could not know and that the Father could know, and how there could be distinct, how could could have their separate forms of consciousness. But that, that gets into some pretty,
probably a whole other podcast. Just to touch on that issue, though, just slightly, what Jesus was doing, he was quoting from the Old Testament. He was quoting from Psalms when he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So it wasn't kind of like an original thing. But if he were a perfect man, then he has to be able to enter into despair just like us. He has to know what it's like to feel despair. And that is him acknowledging the worst possible moment of his life. He is in despair, but that he doesn't let despair crush his faith. See, and that's the same thing for us. We may be in suffering to the point of total despair where we cry out, why have you forsaken me, God? But that doesn't matter, because my faith is what really makes me the perfect individual, not whether or not I despair or not.
Right. I think something that I find very interesting about this conversation for future topics would be trying to understand what it means to be perfect in this sense. What it means, what Christ's perfection really means. And, does that make him immune from despair and doubt? Because like you said, if it did make him immune from despair, doubt, it would make him equally immune from injury. And he had to undergo despair, doubt, physical injury, and physical pain in order for us to have that communion that you talk about. So what aspect of Christ is perfect? Where is the sinlessness of Christ? Because he is sinless, or maybe it's just a matter of, maybe it's a genetic issue. Maybe Christ is sinless because he didn't have an earthly father. And maybe it's just as simple as that. Yeah,
well, we don't want to think of sin and sinlessness as so much focused on the conduct as well as on the unity. Remember we talked, and Kierkegaard writes about this too, about the initial sin of Adam wasn't so much that he plucked the fruit off the tree, but was the anxiety that he had about doing it. The fact that the actual sin takes place prior to the deed, because he became independent of God, and he became aware of his independence of God. But Jesus never was independent of God. He was always dependent upon God from the moment he was born to the moment he died. That total dependency is his sinlessness, is his perfection.
I see. Let me. I want to ask you one tech issue. Can you still hear me okay on your end?
Yes. Yeah, you're coming through fine.
Yeah. Okay. It was you were breaking up just a little bit. I think it may have passed now.
Okay.
This should be fine. I think we're rounding out the first discourse here, and we might want. I don't know. Do you want to keep going? Do you want to do you want to
Let's.
just keep going?
I think I've said about everything that I can about the two of them, about both parts and the first one. Yeah.
Of the first one. Should we just go ahead and move to the second upbuilding discourse then?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Because I think this one might proceed a little quicker, because I think we may have talked a good deal about a lot of the stuff. I think we have been going for, it flies, doesn't it? I think we've been going for almost an hour and a half.
Oh, have we?
Yeah, but I think we can get this. I think we can get this done in probably at a good clip. Okay. So, the second upbuilding discourse is called "Every good and every perfect gift is from above," and again, it starts off with a prayer, and he talks about how everything we receive from God's hand, and if it may seem to us that we're not being given something that we want, that it may be the case that God is actually withholding a larger blessing for us, which I've seen work out in my own life, how I've wanted certain things and didn't get them, and I'm so thankful that I didn't get them. Is there anything else that you would want to say about the prayer there at the beginning of the second discourse?
Well, the notes I have is that the theme was that God controls all and that he knows how to control all things for our ultimate benefit. So
yes.
Yeah, that's about all I have about the prayer there.
So then he goes into the epistle of the Apostle James, chapter 1, verses 17 through 22. And he's going to repeat this a lot. And he includes this passage that he'll repeat throughout the second upbuilding discourse. And I'll just go ahead and read it here. This is not the whole verses 17 through 22, but this is the significant portion that he quotes over again. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, which is a really wonderful way to conceive of God, by the way, the Father of lights, with whom there is no change or shadow of variation. And he wants us to understand that these are very serious words, not just mere platitudes. And we've talked about this, how that God's eternal, unchangeable nature makes it impossible for him to tempt. Like, we can't really get him to come down to the temporal level and give us what we want or make bargains with him. And I really enjoyed this quote from page 33 after he repeats that Bible verse again. That even though there may be some sort of contented people out there that give the impression that they're doing just fine without God's beneficence, he has this to say about them. And I think this is so true. On page 33, it says, "For them, life has no riddle, and yet their life is a riddle, a dream, and an apostle's earnest admonition. Do not go astray, does not halt them." God is a hypothesis that blankets over all of my world, and I can't possibly explain how an unmoved mover brought this all into existence, or why he felt it necessary to sacrifice his son for humanity or for my personal soul or whatever. And I have to admit that there's something very scandalous about the cross, and I've got this massive riddle that a secular person does not have to address. There's like, oh yeah, we just came out of amino acids and then you just take a big dirt nap, and there's no riddle to that. But then I look about how by denying that riddle, there is still a massive riddle within, and all the different things. And Kierkegaard documents this throughout his authorship, how people try to untangle that riddle that's within them, and how it ultimately all fails and all culminates in despair until they come back to this belief in God. I don't know. I thought these were really poetic words. I don't know if it's introducing a ton of new philosophical content, but I did appreciate the language. I quoted this on my Facebook. I love this line, and I'll let you talk. I just want to get this last one in here. What does the wave care about whence it comes or whither it goes? I especially think about this in regards to social media, and how so many people have denied that riddle of God and
Mhm.
are aggregating into groups and are so unconcerned. Like, it just, whatever is outraging them at that moment is where that wave goes. And there's really no concern for ontological foundations or for any sort of future communion or anything like that. Did these words speak to you? Did you find them significant?
Oh yeah, yeah, very much so. James is a book that's not frequently read, probably, as some of the others, especially by Lutherans. Uh, Luther didn't particularly care for the book of James. He called it a work of straw. So I think it was the last book he put in his Bible, optional. But there's a lot in James that's very good. The idea, but I don't know whether I would have come to the same conclusion without Kierkegaard here. Having read James on my own, yeah, I'm not sure that I would have been able to come to the same conclusion. I think that he really did, his discourse really did step up to the plate this time and gave us a different idea, a different perspective on this portion of James anyway. So
this is one of the first times I ever really thought about James. What if you hadn't had Kierkegaard? What would be your impression of the book of James?
Oh, of the whole book of James?
I suppose. Well, I'm kind of curious why Luther was so down on it.
Is because it never really mentions the crucifixion and it never mentions the deity of Christ. It doesn't mention Christ very much. It seems to be more almost avoid that in his, apparently in his comments. Yeah, he felt that it really didn't come to the standard. It didn't really have the gospel in it that Luther was looking for. It was more advice on how to be a good person. So he didn't feel that was all that important, and what I've read about it anyway. But James is very helpful. If you read the story of James, you'll find out he was a martyr. He was murdered at the end. He was the head of the church in Jerusalem, and then he was murdered eventually.
Wasn't James Jesus's brother?
This was, yeah, James, Jesus's brother, yeah. And but there is stuff in here that does, even the very beginning, he calls Jesus his Lord. He refers to him as the Lord Jesus Christ. So he does acknowledge that there is a divinity in Christ. It's just not as much as some of the others. This saying that he gives us here